A fist hammered the front door on West Moncrief Place, hard enough to rattle the glass, and still the house stayed silent. The porch light was off. The curtains were drawn. Philip Peters was a man of routine, and the quiet felt wrong enough that his neighbors stopped being polite and started being scared. They tried the knob. Locked. They walked the windows. Locked. They circled the back. Locked. Finally, a smaller neighbor climbed and slipped through a loose screen, then unlatched the door from inside. The air that rolled out was stale and close, like a room that had been shut too long. They called Philip's name, stepped carefully, and found him on the floor before they found anything else. Philip was 73, retired from the Denver and Rio Grande Western Railroad, a husband and father who had lived in that house for decades. His wife Helen wasn't there. She was at St. Anthony's Hospital, recovering from a broken hip after a fall, and for weeks Philip had been sleeping alone at home while visiting her. Neighbors had been feeding him in the evenings so he wouldn't sit by himself at the table, and he'd take leftovers for lunch the next day. On the night of October 17, 1941, he didn't come by for the usual meal, and when he didn't answer his door, they came over and forced their way inside. The police arrived to a house that looked undisturbed from the outside. Doors and windows were secured. There was no obvious path the killer had taken. Inside, the violence was clear, but the exit wasn't. Officers searched room to room, opened closets, checked under beds, and swept flashlights across the upstairs, assuming the attacker had already gone. They found no footprints, no neighbor who'd seen a stranger run, no sign of a struggle that spilled outside. By midnight, the story on the street was already forming. Whoever did this had vanished without a trace, and the house itself was keeping the secret. The answer was already in the house. Theodore Coneys was 58 and drifting through Denver with poor health and no stable work. He wasn't a random prowler to Philip Peters. Years earlier, the two men had crossed paths through the Denver Guitar Club, where Philip and Helen played and sometimes gave lessons. Coneys knew the address. He knew the layout. He also knew the small openings in a life that looks solid from the outside, but feels vulnerable when you're hungry. When Helen broke her hip, the household pattern changed. Philip spent long stretches at the hospital, and Coneys came to the house hoping to ask for money or food. No one answered, so he broke in and took what he could find. Inside a closet, he noticed something most people never notice in their own homes. A trapdoor cut into the ceiling. It led to a cramped attic cubbyhole, narrow and hidden. Coneys climbed up, saw how easily the door could be pulled closed from inside, and decided he didn't just have a hiding place. He had a way to live inside the Peters home without being seen. For weeks, he lived above Philip's head. When the house was empty, Coneys would come down quietly, take food, sometimes a little money, then climb back into the ceiling. He learned how to move without making the old floors complain. He learned which drawers could be opened without a squeak. The longer he stayed, the more the attic became his world. Tight air, rough wood, and the constant discipline of being silent. Then Philip came home and caught him. It was the night of October 17th. Philip walked into his kitchen and saw a tall, gaunt man at the icebox, raiding it like it belonged to him. Philip swung at him with a cane, trying to drive him back. Coneys fought, desperate and cornered. In the struggle, Coneys grabbed a heavy cast-iron stove shaker and beat Philip with it until he stopped moving. Coneys didn't sprint out the front door. He didn't flee the neighborhood. He climbed back into the closet, pulled the trapdoor shut, and stayed. While detectives tried to make the scene fit a story they understood, a burglary gone wrong, a personal grudge, a stranger passing through, Coneys was inches above them, pressed into that cubbyhole, listening to every step and every voice. He waited through the first frantic search. He waited through the follow-up checks. And when the house finally emptied again, he came down to eat and then climbed back into the ceiling, as if the murder had only made his hiding place more secure. The case dragged on. Detectives dug through Philip's life looking for enemies and motives, but nothing gave them a clean answer. Helen came home from the hospital a widow, and a friend moved in to help her with meals and chores. That's when the house started behaving like something was wrong with it. Food vanished. Items were found out of place. Doors that had been shut were found slightly ajar. There were noises upstairs at hours when no one should have been awake, the faint scrape of movement overhead that made the rooms feel occupied. Helen stayed longer, stubborn and grieving, but the unease didn't stop. The odor would drift down at times, sour and hard to locate, and then vanish again. Neighbors noticed lights that shouldn't have been on. They reported sounds in a house that was supposed to be quiet. Officers would respond, walk through the rooms, look around, find nothing, and leave. No one wanted to believe a murderer could still be inside, yet the building refused to feel empty. Helen finally relocated to Grand Junction to live with her son, and the house stood vacant. It should have gone still. Instead, the complaints continued. Coney's stayed up there through the seasons. In that tight space, he collected waste, rarely washed, and lived in filth that grew heavier with time. He came down only when he thought it was safe, moving like a man who understood that discovery meant the end. In July of 1942, Denver police stopped treating the calls like nuisance complaints and started watching the house. Detectives Roy Bloxam and Bill Jackson set up surveillance. At last, they saw movement inside and rushed in, searching room to room. Again, it looked empty, until they heard a small sound upstairs, a faint click that didn't belong to a vacant place. They went to a closet and opened the door. Just then, they spotted a pair of legs disappearing into a ceiling opening. They grabbed, pulled hard, and dragged a man down from the trap door. Theodore Coney's hit the floor, thin and filthy, and the mystery that had gripped the neighborhood suddenly had a face. At headquarters, Coney's confessed. He told them about breaking in for food, about finding the cubbyhole, about living in the attic after the killing and coming down to steal what he needed. To see how he had done it, police sent a small officer into the attic. The space was so cramped and foul that the officer became sick from the stench. Looking at that cubbyhole, Officer Fred Zarnow said what everyone was thinking. A man would have to be a spider to stand it long up there. The nickname was born, and it stuck to Coney's like something you couldn't wash off. In October of 1942, Coney's was convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison. He would die later in the Colorado State Penitentiary in Canyon City. But the part people can't shake happened long before bars and courtrooms. It happened in a normal house with a normal closet, where a hidden door led to a space just big enough for a man to disappear, and close enough that the people below could search every room and still miss him. Thank you for listening to The Lantern's Tale. Subscribe for more true stories, if you dare.